This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is a cattle market update from Tyler Cozzens, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center. He talks about current prices, the Consumer Price Index, and retail prices for beef and eggs. Sarah Lancaster, K-State Weed Specialist, keeps the show rolling as she discusses how herbicides need to be sprayed at the appropriate time for what stage the wheat is at. K-State's Leah Tsoodle, Director of the Land Use Survey Office, concludes the show as she explains two surveys for people to take related to bluestem pasture and irrigated farm lease arrangements. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby. I appreciate it.
Tyler, what are we seeing in the cattle market this past week?
Yeah, so in general, kind of across the board on the cattle side of things, definitely seeing some stronger prices kind of across the board. So look at some of those steer prices, feeder steer prices on the kind of weight breakdown, specifically looking at Dodge City, Kansas prices here. Those 5 to 6 weights were $366 last week. That's actually up $8 from the prior week. 6 to 7 weights were at $337. That's up about $9. 7 to 8 weights were $291. That's slightly higher than a week ago. 8 to 9 weights were $272. That's up about $6. And then those about 900 to 1,000 pound steers were even with a year ago. If we look on the heifer side of things, kind of similar discussion there. Those 5 to 6 weights and 7 to 8 weights were about even with a year ago. That's 337 for the 5 to 6 weights and 286 for 6 to 7 weights. 7 to 8 weights and 9 to 8 weights were 262 and 245 respectively there. That's up about $6 and $1 respectively. And then those 900 to 1,000 pound heifers were $233. That's actually up $8 from a year ago. We kind of look across the board there compared to those prices to a year ago. We're looking at some pretty strong gains from a year ago. Those prices up being, upwards of $20 to $30 to $40 across the board there for those steer and heifer feeder prices. So some strong gains there compared to a year ago. If we look on the Fed side of things, steer and heifer prices were actually $2 last week. That's actually up to almost $3 from the prior week. And that's actually a $15 gain from a year ago. If we look at those on a dress basis, those steer and heifer prices were $316. That's actually up almost $4 from prior week. Still a strong gains there compared to a year ago. That's up about $18 to almost $23 for those steers and heifers on a dress basis. Now, if we switch over to the choice box beef prices, definitely seeing some stronger demand there for those cutout values there. The aggregate cutout value was actually $320 this last week. That's actually up about $6 from the prior week, up about $9 from a year ago. Look at some of those primal cuts, seeing gains across the board there. Rib, obviously, one of those larger gains, up about $18 to $495. But then kind of across the board, gains were up about $3 to almost $8 for the chuck, round loin, brisket, short plate, and flank. So definitely seeing some stronger gains there and definitely a positive sign as we kind of move through March here, kind of lead our way up to the grilling season, seeing some of these box beef prices holding very strong here.
And recently the Consumer Price Index was released. And what are some numbers we're seeing with the CPI?
Yeah, so CPI is kind of one of those gauges that we get once a month to kind of give us an indication as far as just overall inflationary measures that are going on, just for kind of those basket of goods that the consumers are purchasing there on a regular basis. So if we look at the all item CPI or Consumer Price Index for February, it was an increase of 2.8% compared to the same month a year ago. Now, if we look at this from the prior month in January of 2025, the change in January was actually an increase of 3%. So we've moved a slightly lower than we were from the prior month. So this slight reduction, it kind of signals just some a little bit looser inflationary pressures, but we have to keep in mind that we're still kind of looking for that target inflationary rate of about 2%. So still a little bit of work there to be done, but definitely compared to where we were, even just a couple of years ago, we've definitely seen some vast improvement there as far as just some of those inflationary measures kind of working their way through the economy. And by and large, kind of getting back to closer to that 2% level, which is where we were kind of prior to 2020 and kind of that pandemic era there. So getting a little bit closer to that 2% inflationary measure is definitely a positive sign thing. And one of those things when we look at the CPI, they actually have some other disaggregated components that they look at, and a couple of them I want to discuss here were the meat CPI, poultry CPI, and dairy CPI. So those measures that we can look at as far as what's going on in those kind of maybe more a little bit individualized components for the CPI. And so specifically the meat CPI came in at an increase of 4% from last year. That's slightly higher than what we saw in the prior month of January of 3.8%. But I think, the gradual increase that we've seen in this meat CPI, we've seen this occurring for several months now, but still we're well below those double-digit levels that we saw even just a couple of years ago in 2022. Poultry CPI, it was actually up 1% in February, which was the highest annual increase in about a year. But overall, it was still a small percentage change and in line with where measures have been over the last several months. Dairy CPI came in with an increase of less than 1%, actually 0.8%, which was in line with where dairy CPI has been for several months now. So kind of overall, some of this discussion on CPI, the measures indicate that inflationary prices have cooled somewhat to start the year, which is a positive sign for consumers.
And another report that was recently released involved retail meat prices and how are our current meat prices comparing to last year? Yeah,
so kind of that retail meat price discussion, we get that report as well once a month from USDA ERS using some of that BLS data. And so, retail meat prices, kind of generally in February moved higher from a year ago for most reported meats, which could kind of lead to some higher CPI measures in the coming months. So one of those things to watch there. But specifically, I want to discuss some of the beef retail price measures that were in that report. So if we look at the retail beef price in February, it's actually $8.64 per pound, which was an increase of 7% from last year and actually the highest on record for retail beef prices. Now, the record beef price, it's noteworthy as it comes during February, which is often considered a slow month for beef demand. And for meat demand in general. This is due, kind of the slowing of this meat demand and beef demand during these kind of first quarter of the year. It's kind of, you think what's going on. We're kind of in the middle of winter and just people aren't outside grilling as much. So that demand does slow down. So seeing this record beef price in February is definitely noteworthy and something to watch. And I kind of flag that because, we kind of as we get closer to the Memorial Day, that's kind of the unofficial start to grilling season and summer and people being outside more, and definitely we see a little bit more of an uptick in just overall retail beef prices. So something to watch here in the coming months. As far as other beef prices that were reported, ground beef actually reached, it almost reached $6 per pound in February. It's $5.96 per pound. It's actually a record, an increase of 9% from last year. Roast reached a record of $8 per pound in February, which was an increase of 9% from last year. Steaks came in at a record of $12.01 per pound in February, which was an increase of 2% from last year, and the first time that the price for steaks have actually reached above $12 per pound. So overall, February's retail beef prices were higher, and a few more record prices were set there on some of those cuts, which is a noteworthy thing that I noted kind of for this time frame that we're in as we kind of head into getting closer to this peak grilling demand season.
And as we're thinking about consumers and prices, wanting to take the time to note some changes you've seen with eggs, especially when it comes to HPAI.
Yeah, so in that retail price discussion side of things, they do report egg prices there, and eggs have definitely been one of those items that have popped up in the news cycles and just a little bit noted a little bit more there. And so I want to bring up some just a discussion on the egg side of things and just HPAI. Eggs have been getting a little bit more of this attention. And actually in February, those retail egg prices reported were $5.90 per dozen. That's actually nearly double the $3 per pound price that was reported a year ago. February's egg price of $5.90 per dozen was also a record price. And as you might expect, a lot of this is just due to highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI, as this has been a primary factor driving a lot of these egg prices higher, as it's affected a lot of these egg layer flocks. And so one of the things that I did was pull some of the more recent data from USDA's APHIS on just the HPAI outbreaks across the U.S. and the poultry sector. And if we kind of look at 2025 here, since the start of the year, APHIS is actually reporting 36.1 million birds affected by HPAI. This is a significant amount of birds affected in just over 2 months. So if we kind of compare this to some of those prior years, total birds affected over the whole year by HPAI was 58 million in 2022, 22 million in 2023, and 51 million in 2024. So to reach this 36 million mark for birds affected in just over 2 months is a much faster pace than what we saw in prior years with these HPAI cases. So if we kind of break this down a little bit more and look at what sectors of the poultry industry have been impacted a little bit more, disproportionately, the egg layers are the ones that are affected more significantly here. So in 2025, about 86% of the total cases reported have been on the egg side of things, primarily egg layers. But if we look at kind of past years' HPAI outbreaks, egg layers and just sort of egg side of things have been hit primarily the worst, taking a brunt of all of this. But also you're seeing some impacts in the turkey and broiler side of things. But I think just the overall effects have been on the egg layer side of things, which is why you're seeing some of this volatility in egg prices and industry trying to just adjust to supply constraints and just meeting the demand of eggs in the market as a whole. So one thing we have to keep in mind here that from a seasonal standpoint, from one of the things we've seen from some of these prior HPAI outbreaks, reported cases typically increase during the migratory seasons in March and April, and then again during the fourth quarter of the year. So potentially, we're sitting here in March that we may see more cases yet ahead once the migratory season is in full swing, which could further impact the poultry supplies and just the poultry industry as a whole.
Tyler, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about herbicide decisions for wheat with K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Always a pleasure to be here, Shelby.
Sarah, as we're thinking about herbicides for wheat, what's an important factor to consider?
There are a few factors to consider, Shelby, but the one that we talked about in the e-update last week was paying attention to the growth stage of your wheat. A lot of our herbicides for post-emergence application in wheat can be applied either fall or spring, but really the key driver is how big is the wheat. So some of them need to be, generally 2 to 3 leaf on your wheat, and then some of them have cutoffs on the backside of, anything from jointing to boot. So just being aware of what those cutoffs are is important to avoid damaging your wheat.
Is it also important to get it done, if label allows, before canopy?
Yeah, so honestly, as with most crops, the sooner the better, Shelby. You will, generally speaking, do a better job of preserving yield potential when you take that weed competition out in the fall. Obviously, better late than never, but generally speaking, we'll see better weed control if we spray in the fall compared to in the spring, and then better yield potential as well.
What are some applications that are permitted prior to jointing?
Yeah, so some of the things that we need to get on before jointing, a big one would be dicamba. So dicamba can go on between 2-leaf and jointing. If you wait too long, it's going to have a significant impact on yield. Other things to think about as far as applications prior to jointing would be the clear field wheats. So a lot of folks are, I think, using double stop, which is a 2-gene clear field wheat. And so we can apply up to the second node for clear field wheat. So the other herbicide tolerant wheats would be the coaxium varieties. And so aggressors should be sprayed after 4-leaf, but before jointing begins. And so, timing that so that you're spraying small weeds can be a little bit tricky. The other thing to be aware of for all of our applications to winter wheat this time of year, all of our herbicide applications this time of year, is the influence of temperature on weed growth, right? So we want to get a few days kind of either side of that herbicide application where we have temperatures above freezing and the plants are actively growing, so that we can get the herbicides to translocate through the plants. So that's especially important for products like Quizalofop. It's really sensitive to that temperature thing.
Are there some other newer products that people could possibly be using?
Yeah, so some other products would be, some newer products would be things like Tarzak. So Tarzec is a Corteva product that is a combination of PowerFlex and Elevore. So PowerFlex will bring some grass activity and Elevore will bring some broadleaf activity. It's a group 4 herbicide, somewhat similar to 2,4-D and dicamba. It will bring good activity on horseweed, not so good activity on some of our other drivers like kochia or Palmer amaranth.
What about Iron Gate?
Iron Gate is a brand new product to the Weed Guide this year. It is a combination of PowerFlex and Everest. So it has activity on some of our key grasses as well as the mustard species.
What about some applications that are permitted through boot?
So applications that can go on through boot stage would be things like Ally 2,4-D would be a big one there. Glean, some of the starring products. Starring is going to be the one to go for probably if you have kochia that you're trying to control there. And then we should probably talk just a minute more about 2,4-D. Folks that have been growing wheat for a while will know that 2,4-D has to be applied after the plant has started tillering. So the way the herbicide interacts with the hormones in the plant, you can reduce tillering and therefore yield potential if you apply 2,4-D too early. Now, one of the alternatives to that some folks will opt for would be to use MCPA instead of 2,4-D. MCPA is also a group 4 herbicide that is a plant growth regulator, but it doesn't have quite the same negative effects on the wheat as 2,4-D.
What damage, if the application timing is wrong, can these different herbicides do to wheat?
Yeah, so, we've talked about the 2,4-D situation, reducing tillering, so you can get injury on that side. But if you apply too late, you can get malformed heads, you can get kind of blank heads. And so you can, especially as you get closer to that head being expressed or coming out through the plant, you can have some risk of crop injury there.
What are some different formulations of 2,4-D or MCPA?
So that's a great question. So really we talk about, let's back up just a minute. 2,4-D and MCPA are both salts formulations. So that means you've got the active ingredient and then you've got this extra little piece tacked onto it. Okay. And so that extra little piece either makes the formulation an amine. So that's a nitrogen-based piece, or an ester. And that's just more carbon molecules on there. So things to think about are that amine formulations generally don't play as well in tank mixes. Ester formulations tend to provide better weed control. That's kind of a rule of thumb that we talk about in our weed science classes. But as we move into warmer weather and we start thinking about off-target movement, ester formulations tend to be more volatile and more likely to move away from the site of application. So each has their place.
Is nitrogen also an important factor when we think about spraying?
Yeah, so a lot of these herbicides are going to have labels to be used with nitrogen as a nitrogen fertilizer as a carrier. So like a UAN type of product oftentimes is the carrier. Some of these products say that you can mix with up to a certain percentage of UAN as a carrier. So just being aware of what you're putting in the tank and how well it's going to play with the UAN as a carrier there is important, especially for like those amine formulations of things like 2,4-D.
What applications can happen through flag leaf?
Yeah, so thinking about going through flag leaf, kind of some of the big ones there would be some of the newer products from Corteva that include that active ingredient of haloxifin, which is the trade name there is Elevore. So some of those would be Pixaro, Culex, Resuvent, and Wide Arm Match. So again, those are going to bring some broadleaf control, not necessarily for our summer annuals, but for mare's tail, mustards, and henbit.
Have we accidentally potentially created some more competition for us when it comes to goat grass and wheat?
Oh, that's a great question, Shelby. So one of the things that I was asked to speak about this winter with Dr. Alan Fritz, since he's the real scientist, right? He does the wheat breeding and understands the genetics. We've been talking a little bit this winter about outcrossing between jointed goat grass and wheat. So jointed goat grass is essentially a wild relative of wheat, and there is a potential for wheat and jointed goat grass to cross-pollinate. So one of the reasons that's important is because we mentioned clearfield wheats and coaxium wheats when we were talking about some of these application choices. And that creates an additional opportunity to create herbicide resistance. So there was some work done in the Pacific Northwest, and they tracked how far the wheat pollen will move and transfer into jointed goat grass. And it's something like 250 feet, something in that ballpark. So not super far, but far enough that if you have jointed goat grass that's not controlled, say in your road ditches or your field borders, right, we could start to have problems. The frequency of occurrence is not super high, but when you start thinking about the number of plants that we're dealing with, right, even if it's a low frequency of a high number can still be, in some situations, can be meaningful, right? What we do is, so now we have herbicides that are already kind of prone to developing resistance just through the process of selection. This outcrossing is more of an issue in the coaxium wheat than it is in the clearfield wheats, just because of where that herbicide resistance gene is found in the wheat genome. And again, that's an Allen thing. That's not a Sarah thing. That's an Allen thing. But so as we think about those coaxium wheats, we have two kind of modes of developing resistance there if we think about it and we're not careful. So one is just that process of selection, right? Kind of overuse or repeated use of similar herbicides. And then the other would be this idea of outcrossing. And so we can actually send the genes that were intentionally put into the wheat, we can accidentally send those into wild relatives. So this has been documented for other species as well. I think you and I have chatted about the potential for some of our herbicide-resistant traits in grain sorghum to move over to Johnson grass and chattercane. If you go further north, they worry about herbicide-resistant traits in canola outcrossing to some of the wild mustard species. So it's a real issue and something that folks need to be aware of. And it just makes things like keeping your field borders clean, tarping trucks so we're not accidentally spreading seed of a herbicide-resistant crop around the countryside. It just makes those kind of sanitation types of practices that much more important.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Always a pleasure, Shelby.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. I will link her Agronomy E-Update article titled Spring Herbicide Decisions on Wheat. Pay attention to the growth stage in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about a couple of surveys with Director of the Land Use Survey Office at K-State, Leah Tsoodle. Leah, thanks for joining us today.
Shelby, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you promoting our surveys.
Leah, the first survey for us to talk about today, the 2025 Bluestem Pasture Survey, and what is this survey?
So we're surveying the 14 counties that are in the native tallgrass pasture area, and the survey's always been known as the Bluestem Pasture Survey. These counties, their pasture is just unique, and so we have a survey that is unique to those counties. We're trying to get at what the leasing rates are, because the opportunities, the grazing potential for these pastures is just different enough that they have a slightly different leasing market. So we have this pasture to see what those leasing rates are currently in those 14 counties. They also have a lot of unique arrangements in their leases, in the way that they provide care, the level of care services. So it makes getting all of the details of those particular leases is really important to arrive at a rate for landowners and for people who are leasing land. We are trying to gather all of that information with this survey.
How do you use that information?
So we put it out in a report for the folks in the counties, in those counties, to use as a benchmark. It's not saying this is what your lease rate should be, but it's saying This is an average of the area around you.
What is the deadline for this bluestem survey?
So the deadline's set for April the 30th. So if you have information on native tallgrass pasture leasing rates in those 14 counties, please click the link and complete the survey online before April 30th.
Leah, another survey that you guys are currently running, the 2025 Kansas Irrigated Farm Lease Arrangement Survey. And what is this survey?
Besides a mouthful, the Irrigated Lease Survey is we are trying to arrive at how much landlords participate in various expenses on irrigated land. And it differs because in this survey, we also include how much the landlord owns of the irrigated equipment. So it's similar to our non-irrigated leasing survey, but we also ask about equipment. And of course, that equipment is going to mean generally the ownership of that equipment might change how landlords participate in the other line items. So we have to separate out our non-irrigated and our irrigated leasing arrangement surveys.
And what do you use this information for?
So again, we publish a report, and that helps people to arrive at averages and have a benchmark. Largely, these surveys are providing an information source for people who are actively involved in leasing land, be it landowners or the operators, and to give them an idea of what's going on in the market. This is private information. So we are one of the few sources where you can see what sort of averages are out there.
What's the deadline for this survey?
The deadline for this survey is also April 30th. These deadlines are set so that we can get the information out to the users as soon as possible, because it takes a couple of months. Well, we started these surveys in January, so it takes a few months to gather the data. And then we have to clean it, and then we have to aggregate it and put it together in a report that's user-friendly.
Where can people find these surveys?
The bluestem and the irrigated survey are both on agmanager.info.
That was Director of the Land Use Survey Office at K-State, Leah Tsoodle. I will link these surveys in today's show notes on agtoday.net. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.